Hi, this is Gary with MacMost.com. Let's talk about how to use the right words when talking to somebody about your Mac. MacMost is brought to you thanks to a great group of more than 2,000 supporters. Go to MacMost.com/Patreon. There you could read more about it, join us, and get exclusive content and course discounts. Now, when you're communicating about your Mac, whether you're talking to a tech support person or just making a comment online, you want to make sure you use the right terms. It's very common to use the wrong word when talking about technology. But when you're asking for a technical solution to a problem, this can be an issue. For instance, let's start off with the term taskbar. This is something I hear a lot, especially if you're coming from Windows to Mac. People are asking questions about the taskbar. Where's the taskbar? How do I do this with the taskbar? But there's no such thing on the Mac. That's something that you have on Windows. On a Mac, though, sometimes people map that term in their mind to something else, and it could be many different things. So it's important to use the right word. For instance, here on the Mac desktop, I've got the menu bar here at the top. Sometimes people think of that as the taskbar since it's not at the top of a window like it is in Windows. In terms of functionality, a lot of the items in the taskbar are actually found in what's called the Apple menu here. So if you want to refer to this specifically, just call it the Apple menu. But when people use the term taskbar, sometimes they're really just talking about the dock here at the bottom. That's this row of icons here. And it mostly contains apps, and it's an easy way to launch apps, but it can have other items to the right as well. I've even heard people use the term taskbar to refer to what's called the app switcher. This is what you get when you use Command and Tab, and it brings up the app switcher here. You can click on any of these apps or just continue to Command Tab around till you get to the app you want and then release to go to that app. And while we're looking at these terms, I should also mention Control Center, which is this button here, which brings up all these different controls. You can get to a lot of system settings here without actually going to the System Settings app. And if you click on the date or time at the upper right hand corner or use another gesture, you can bring up Notification Center, which brings up notifications at the top and widgets below that. Now, sometimes it's not that important to get the term exactly right. For instance, there are two terms people use interchangeably, cursor and pointer. So technically, the arrow that you see me moving here, that is the pointer. The pointer is the thing that you can move with your mouse or trackpad. But people often just call this the cursor. The cursor technically is this blinking line here that's in text. The cursor is always in some text, and it's something you move by typing or using the arrow keys. But in this case, even if you use the wrong term, usually the person you're talking to understands what you're saying. Another pair of terms that people use interchangeably, especially when dealing with text, is selection and highlight. So if I were to use the pointer here and select some text, this is the selection. However, sometimes people will say that they highlight the text. Technically, that's not right. Highlighting can refer to either an editing function. For instance, here in Pages, you could highlight. And notice once I do that, the text stays with a colored background like this, and that's highlighted, like using a highlighter on text on a piece of paper. You can also say that when you take text and then assign a text background color to it, that is also a kind of highlight. But when you're just using the pointer to select text, that's called a selection. And we'd also use the term selection when you're selecting, say, a file or another kind of object in an app, like, say, a shape in Pages or Keynote. Now, when identifying your Mac, people often use the wrong terms. For instance, an extreme example would be when somebody simply refers to their Air. But there's an iPad Air and there's also a MacBook Air. So it's important to be specific because obviously technical solutions are going to vary greatly depending upon which one of those you have. And in addition, it's important to specify not just MacBook, but whether it's a MacBook Air or a MacBook Pro. And of course, there's also a very much older model just called a MacBook. So when referring to your Mac, it's important to specify exactly what type of machine you have, and usually that includes the year. If I go to the Apple menu here and About This Mac, for instance, it will show that I've got a Mac Studio 2022. The year is very important. It identifies which model you have. A MacBook Pro 2017 and a MacBook Pro 2023 are very different pieces of hardware. And even when people specify the piece of hardware they have, usually that's not the most important piece of information, especially when it comes to software problems and solutions. What is most important is the version of macOS they have. So in this case, you can see it's macOS Sonoma. When asking questions about how to do things, where buttons are, what things are called, what the step-by-step is for accomplishing a task, the version of macOS is usually more important than the actual Mac hardware that you have. So if you want to be complete about it, you wouldn't say, I've got a MacBook, how do I do this? But instead, I've got a MacBook Pro 2023 and it's running macOS Sonoma. And while we're talking about operating systems, it's important to get those terms right as well. Macs, of course, run macOS. But so often I hear people refer to iOS instead. Somebody will say, my Mac has iOS Sonoma. And that, of course, isn't right. iOS is for the iPhone. And also iPadOS. That's for the iPad. And going back to macOS, for some years now, it's referred to as macOS. Only much older versions are referred to as OS X or, as some people say, OS X. But macOS has been the correct term for a while now. There are also some antiquated terms that some people seem to use a lot. For instance, people still refer to the Photos app as iPhoto. But iPhoto was discontinued way back in 2013, and the app has been called Photos since. So when somebody asks for help using iPhoto, it's just this extra step to have to ask, are you really using the old iPhoto app or are you talking about the modern Photos app? And the same thing is true for the terms iTunes and iWork. iTunes is a much older app that years ago was separated into music, books, TV, and podcast apps. And also people still use the term iWork, even though Apple really doesn't use that term anymore. That used to refer to the suite of apps including Pages, Numbers, and Keynote. But those are all individual apps now that you can get from the App Store. And the term iWork was really just a marketing term for the three of those when they used to be sold. Now let's look at the term iMessage too. So there are two different similar sounding things. One is Messages, which refers to the Messages app here on the Mac or on the iPhone or iPad. But the Messages app can communicate with other people using several systems. One of those systems, if you go to Settings here, is iMessage. iMessage is Apple's proprietary messaging system where you can send messages back and forth with other Apple users. But the Messages app, say on the iPhone, can use iMessage and also your mobile phone carrier SMS system as well. But if you are just referring to the app and how to use the app, it's correct to say the Messages app, not iMessage. And another term that's incorrectly used is iCloud. If you go into System Settings here and you go to your Apple ID and then look at iCloud, you can see here that iCloud refers to a variety of different services. A lot of times people use iCloud interchangeably with iCloud Drive. iCloud Drive is just one part of iCloud. It's the part that allows you to see all of your files across all your different devices. But it's separate from, say, iCloud Photos and an iCloud email address and many more different services offered as part of the iCloud service. So iCloud basically refers to a wide variety of Apple's data services. iCloud Drive is specifically about files. Now let's talk about your Mac's keyboard. And this also applies to iPad keyboards as well. Your keyboard has several modifier keys. These are Shift, Control, Option, and Command. These are the modifier keys, although you could also include the FN, or as Apple calls it more recently, the globe key. These keys modify what you're doing when you press something else. So pressing C, for instance, by itself types the letter C, but Command C is the copy command in most apps. But notice I didn't mention anything about an Alt key because Mac keyboards don't have an Alt key. When people use the term Alt, they're probably referring to the Option key. And this goes back to two separate things. One is on Windows there's no Option key, there's an Alt key, and it serves a similar function. And also some much older Mac keyboards years ago would have the term Alt on the key as well as Option, probably to help Windows users transition easier. But it's important to refer to the key as you see it on the keyboard, so is the Option key. And people also often confuse the Control and Command key. This also goes back to Windows because on Windows, Control is the primary modifier key, but on the Mac, Command is the primary modifier key. So on Windows, for instance, Control-C is copy, whereas on Mac, Command-C is copy. But people sometimes will just say Control-C when they mean Command-C. But if you're trying to get technical help from somebody, but when you're trying to talk about something at a technical level, it's important to get it right. So say Command when you mean the Command key. Let's talk about the different ports on your Mac. If you look at most modern Macs today, you'll see a common port that's shaped like an oval, and the correct term for this is Thunderbolt. However, sometimes people refer to this as lightning, and you could see why, because it's got a little lightning symbol next to it. After all, that symbol is technically lightning. It's not thunder, which is a sound. But lightning is actually the type of connector that's used on older iPhones, and it's still used on lots of devices, including the modern Mac keyboard, trackpad, and mouse. They all use a lightning connector to charge. So you still have lots of use of a lightning connector, and it's a very specific shape, and it's proprietary to Apple. A Thunderbolt connection is different. It doesn't actually talk about the shape. The shape itself is USB-C, but the actual type of connection is Thunderbolt, which includes several different things. A Thunderbolt connection can typically carry lots of different types of data, including USB data, DisplayPort data to connect to screen, and the Thunderbolt data protocol, as well as other things like actually getting and sending power. So it gets very confusing when thinking of USB-C versus Thunderbolt. USB-C is the physical shape, whereas Thunderbolt describes a set of different types of connections that can go over the cable. But you could also have a USB-C port that just carries USB. Think of these as different languages. There's the language called USB, there's a language called Thunderbolt, a language called DisplayPort, a language called power or electricity, and a USB-C connection can sometimes only speak one of those languages, like just USB, and sometimes it's multilingual, and it can speak USB and Thunderbolt and DisplayPort and power. When a USB-C port is multilingual like that, it's called Thunderbolt. When it can only speak one language, USB, it's just called a USB port. Let's talk about the term that people may misuse the most, and that is memory. I hear people use the term memory, but they don't mean the memory of the device they're using. They mean the storage on that device. If you look here at the MacBook Air buy page, for instance, you could see each one of these models has an amount of memory and an amount of storage. So storage refers to the either hard drive or solid state drive on your Mac. It's all of your files, all of the stuff that you've got there. If you shut your Mac down, all that stuff is still there on storage. Memory is what's active when the Mac is on and you're using it. So for instance, in storage, you may have thousands of different files. And then when you open one of those files in an app, it brings that file into memory, and then you just have that one file in memory at that moment, and you're working with it. And when you save, it saves a new copy back to storage. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, and there's a lot of overlap because storage is sometimes used for memory overflow. But in general, it's important to realize these are separate things. You don't have a Mac that has 512 gigs of memory. That's not a thing. You have a Mac that has 512 gigs of storage, and it may have 8, 16, or 32 gigs of memory. You would want to get more storage if you want to have more files and larger files stored on your Mac for you to access. But you want to get a Mac with more memory if you want to be able to have more apps open at the same time and have faster response times when using those apps. And another term that people use to describe two different things is battery life. Some people may use the term battery life to describe how long their Mac will last after they unplug it. Will they have 6 hours of battery life, 8 hours of battery life, and so on. Other people will use the same term, battery life, to describe how long the battery will last until they need to replace it. Will it last for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years? If you want to make it clear that you're talking about how long the Mac should last while unplugged, then you may want to talk about battery performance or capacity. If you want to talk about how many years the battery will last before it needs to be replaced, you may want to talk about lifespan or longevity. And these are just the most common terms that I hear people misuse when asking questions online. Beyond these, you always want to think very carefully when asking a technical question. Make sure you're providing the correct details and make sure that the word you're using can't be confused for something else. Not using the right terms can make it harder to get the right answer, or may even produce the wrong answer if the person you're talking to misunderstands you. Hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, click the thumbs up button below to let me know. I publish new tutorials each weekday. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out.